Hello, History 361. So today we're going to be talking about a most relevant topic, and that is the plague in Athens in 430 BC and the start of the Peloponnesian War. Now, when Athens and Sparta go to war in 431, the basic Athenian strategy is dictated, at least according to Thucydides, by Pericles, who really has been the architect of Athenian strategic power since the 450s. Now, Pericles argues that the Athenians should not try to march out and meet the Spartans in a great hoplite battle. And this makes sense. Athens has a pretty good hoplite army, but Sparta has the best hoplite army in Greece, and there's no reason why the Athenians should try to confront Sparta in the kind of domain where Sparta has a natural advantage. What Pericles advocates instead is that Athens use its long walls to its advantage, so that the Athenians will stay behind the long walls, which again connect the Astu of Athens, and then run about 10 miles down to the port of the Piraeus. This means that food can be brought in from the Aegean, and of course any shipments of grain or supplies are protected by Athens' navy, the best navy in Greece, if not in the entire Mediterranean at this point. In fact, unquestionably the best navy in the entire Mediterranean at this point. There's no way that the Spartans can actually cut off Athenian supplies, and basically Pericles advocates waiting the Spartans out. So in the first year of the war and in subsequent years, the Spartans will send a hoplite army into Attica. That army will ravage Attic farms and fields, but it won't be able to really do anything. The Athenians don't go out and confront it, and the longest Spartan incursion is a mere 21 days. And so essentially the goal here is the Athenians, yes, they endure the pain of that Spartan invasion. Some Athenians will suffer damage to their property, but the Spartans at the end of the day are frustrated. The city of Athens is still wealthy because of external trade, because of the empire, and the war goes on. Now, it turns out there is one unforeseen downside to this strategy, and that is when the Spartans do finally invade, significant portions of the Attic countryside are evacuated. Not the entire countryside, but the areas that are actually threatened by the Spartan line of march, those people withdraw to Athens to take shelter in the city's robust fortifications, which means that the city of Athens therefore becomes incredibly crowded. People are living in the space between the walls. They're living in places where people usually don't live. Sanitation is going to be incredibly poor. It's the opposite of social distancing. And in 430, a horrific plague strikes, which causes substantial mortality to the Athenians. It carries off not only common men and women, carries off soldiers. It ultimately kills Pericles himself, and comes close to killing Thucydides, who suffers from the plague but recovers. Now, it's long been a kind of armchair doctor's discussion of what was the plague of Athens. And indeed, doctors have traditionally read Thucydides' relatively detailed description of the symptoms, and then have argued that, well, based on the symptoms, it's smallpox or measles or typhus, or some of you argued it might be Ebola. Now, recently, there was a claim that sought to use DNA evidence to actually settle the debate. The DNA evidence was extracted from several skulls found buried in a mass grave. The study was led by an Athenian dentist, namely because one of the skulls, belonging to an 11-year-old girl who archaeologists have named Myrtis, had such a kind of unusual set of dental pathologies that it was given to a dentist who then subsequently ran the tests. And these tests revealed that several teeth from both Myrtus and also a couple other specimens tested positive for the DNA of the bacteria that causes typhoid fever. And so you will see many people arguing that the evidence is now conclusive the plague of Athens was typhoid fever. Now, I'm not a doctor. It may well be typhoid fever. We should be a little careful, though. It's still possible to have some doubts. One, and this is sort of we've been reading a lot about viruses and RNA. The DNA, which the reason that the teeth are so important is the DNA of bacteria can survive in the enamel of a tooth much longer than it could survive anywhere else, which is how they extracted it to test it. But RNA doesn't survive at all. So it's not impossible that if you had a plague victim who was hit by a virus, let's say the virus is the main plague, they could have a secondary infection. And typhoid fever is caused by a bacteria that tends to be just sort of endemic in the environment. It's in contaminated water, it's in contaminated food. It's primarily actually passed not by person-to-person contact, but through drinking contaminated water, eating contaminated food. And one thing that we do know that happens during big mass epidemics is oftentimes there are multiple pathogens. There's the main pathogen that's sort of wiping everybody out, but as social conditions deteriorate, as there start to be supply problems, logistical problems, sanitation problems, oftentimes there's also secondary infections. Sometimes even individuals who die go down infected by multiple pathogens, and it's even debatable what kills them. This was certainly evident in the Ebola epidemic, where the nations affected by Ebola in 2014-2015 saw not only Ebola outbreaks, but also outbreaks of other epidemic diseases caused by the collapse of the public health system. So it's not impossible that, yes, those victims did indeed have typhoid fever, and typhoid fever may have in fact killed them. It still remains a possibility that there was another viral pathogen that actually drove the main outbreak of the plague, whether it was smallpox, who knows, maybe Ebola. I'm not saying we know this for sure. I'm only saying that it's very, very difficult to diagnose a plague so many years after the fact, even with the seeming conclusive DNA evidence that suggests that, again, at least some people were dying of typhoid fever. Now, Thucydides describes the social breakdown that this plague produces, and indeed we see evidence of the social breakdown by these mass graves. This is not how the Athenians like to bury their dead, where ideally you take your dead, you cremate them, and then you put the bones in an ossuary. And instead, we simply have there are too many people dying. They're dying too quickly to actually deal with them in the traditional manner, and so they're simply being placed in a mass grave with either no grave goods or very, very limited grave goods. And Thucydides describes other evidence for sort of the social breakdown, including people trying to burn a body on a pyre and people sort of sneaking up and trying to throw a second body on the pyre so that they don't have to collect the firewood. Things of that nature caused by the desperation of the plague. Now, it is quite likely that the plague causes very, very heavy casualties in Athens. It may cause a drop in population by anywhere from 10 to 30%, maybe even more. Now, one thing that you will sometimes see, and I've noticed as I look at my Facebook feed and you see sort of plague of Athens related articles ping-ponging around the internet. The plague in Athens does not cause the Athenians to lose the war. They do lose, but not necessarily because of the plague. Nor does it end the Athenian democracy. So if you see an article on the internet that says something like, how a plague ended the Athenian democracy, the person writing that article doesn't know all that much about Greek history. Now, without question, the plague probably reduces Athenian military power in the opening phases of the war, and probably prevents the Athenians from engaging in more aggressive or ambitious military operations in 430, 429, so on. That said, the first phase of the war, which we'll talk about in next lecture, the so-called Archidamian War, basically ends with an Athenian victory, a modest victory, but you really could say that in 421, when the peace is finally signed, the Athenians are the nominal victors. They come out modestly ahead, which means in the first phase of the war, which ends after this, which includes this Great Plague, the Athenians don't lose. So I think there it's very difficult to say, oh, the plague causes the Athenians to lose the war. As we'll see, a series of Athenian mistakes and blunders from 415 down to 406 is what will cause them to lose the final and obviously the most important phase of the Peloponnesian War. But the plague itself can in no way be characterized as the immediate cause of the defeat, not even a proximate cause, although certainly, again, it does have a tragic demographic effect on the city of Athens. Nor does the plague destroy the Athenian democracy. Now, as we will see, the Spartan victory in the Peloponnesian War does briefly halt Athenian democratic practice as the Spartans install an oligarchy at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And yet, democracy comes roaring back. It proves remarkably resilient. And the Athenians will have a democracy all the way down until their defeat by the Macedonians in the Lamian War in the 320s. So the plague doesn't cause the Athenians to lose the war, and it certainly doesn't destroy the Athenian democracy. It is nonetheless a gut punch to Athenian society. It probably does reduce any more ambitious plans that the Athenians might have. And yet, the Athenians prove remarkably resilient. They will bounce, as we'll see in next lecture, they will bounce back from the plague, and they will go on to do relatively well in the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. And so that will be our topic for Friday, namely the Archidamian War from 431 to 421. I'll see you then.